can calculate optimal redistribution if we could observe people's height and basically third-degree price discriminate based on that. So we classify people who are males who are below 5'10" as being short, and they basically receive a subsidy of about 14%. Males of height between 5'10" and 6 should pay a tax of about 4%, and those who are tall should pay a tax of about 7%. This allows us to, without having as progressive of a tax and therefore not discouraging work as much, redistribute more. Now, a lot of people feel that this violates a principle of horizontal equity, and this idea was formalized by Matt Weinzierl's 2012 paper, which formalizes the idea that we wouldn't want two similar people to have to reduce their utility by different amounts in order to fund a public good. So basically, we think that any two individuals should have the same reduction in utility to cover public expenditures, and therefore it's unfair to impose the burden on the unlucky people. So just to give you a sense, here's what the distribution of income based on height looks like. So here are people's wages, and here is like how many people of each height do that. So if you look at the bottom wages, it's mostly poor, short people who are earning those. And you look at the higher wages, you get there's much more likely to be a tall person or a medium height person. Okay. So a similar logic is that one should try to encourage, yeah, go ahead.
So there is correlation for sure, but the correlation seems like not that much high, and that's very problematic because you want some tagging,
yeah.
Very correlated with the income level. Otherwise, we're screwing some people up. They're poor, but because they're just randomly high, you're taking all of their money.
Yeah, well, so the principle of equal sacrifice would say exactly that. That if you just do a utilitarian thing, you do want to take advantage even of really weak correlations. But if you're worried about what you're talking about, which is that some people might be low and some people might be high and we don't want to introduce, then you're going to really avoid doing this unless the correlation is very strong. So it sort of depends on what normative principle you use. But that's a good point. Okay, so a similar logic is that one should try to encourage people to work, because if they work, we as society have a stake in them working now because we're earning some taxes off that, right? So once you're charging a tax, right, you should actually do everything you possibly can to get people to work harder. It's just like as we talked about in the lecture about corporate finance, right? About theory of the firm, whenever someone's not the residual claimant, whenever society gains something from them working harder, we want to do anything we can to encourage people to work harder. And we might use taxes to do this as well. So Daiichi, how might we be able to use taxes to encourage people to work harder? Or subsidies?
Can't you provide training for people?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So you can tax things which are complementary with leisure and subsidize things which are substitutable for leisure. So you could tax vacations, travel, unless you think those things help people recover and go back to work. So you really want to tax any slothful lifestyle rather than a really refreshing vacation, right? And you might subsidize leisure substitutes, such as education, health. You might think that if people are unhealthy, they're not going to work, right? And this helps maximize the productivity of the workforce, which is very similar to tagging in some sense, because a tall but poor person is basically someone who's not working hard enough, right? Because if you're tall, you should be able to earn a lot, but you're not, so that means you must be being lazy. And so basically we're taxing you for being lazy, which is being a tall but not rich person, right? And this is basically the fundamental principle of non-uniform taxation, right? Tagging is that you tax those who are more able. Encouraging work is taxing leisure substitutes. And these are basically the two ways in which the simple interpretation of the second fundamental welfare theorem, which is that you want to tax things as directly as possible on income, come out. So much of tax theory is an attempt to work out some of these caveats on the basic idea that you just tax based on income. One of the most controversial examples of this is capital taxation. You might think that people are saving in order to be able to not work as much in the future. That's one reason you might want to tax people's savings. You also might want to tax people's savings if the people who are most able are also the people who are most patient, which is, and therefore want to save most for the future. Okay, so I think that all of this analysis so far and the main focus on optimal income taxation is quite elegant, but I think it leaves out a number of the issues that we brought up earlier, which I think are very important. So one is that rich people might be richer not because they're able to earn higher wages or they have more ability, but because they value money more. So you might imagine that there's different types of people. Some people value sunset and smoking weed, and they don't need much money to do that. Some people value fancy cars and big houses, and they need a lot of money to do that. If that's the case, then you're not going to want to redistribute as much, because redistributing from the person who values the fancy stuff to the person who values just hanging out is not going to add much value, because the person who values hanging out won't have anything to do with the money. A second possibility is that people may not all be the same behind the veil of ignorance. You might think that, that you can't really go back before the time when you knew what your genes were and buy insurance then. That just doesn't make any sense. And that when we're making the insurance arrangements, we already know our genetic endowments, and therefore you wouldn't want to insure everything. Another fundamental issue is, who is behind the veil of ignorance? Is it just everyone who's currently alive? Or is it everyone who is ever going to be born? Or is it everyone who could potentially ever be born, depending on decisions made by the people who actually are born, right? If you try to go there, then it becomes much more complicated to think about this stuff, right? Another issue is, do we take behind the veil of ignorance everyone within the United States or everyone all over the world? And if we do, then that would lead to radically different policies than we currently have, right? Because if you took everyone around the world behind the veil of ignorance, then you'd want to insure yourself against ending up in Africa. And to do that, you'd want huge transfers from people in the US to people in Africa, right? Another issue is related to social Darwinism, which is that if what makes people richer is that they're smarter, then they might actually be better at allocating money to form new businesses or to form charities, and therefore it might actually be good for the rich to keep their wealth. Another reason why we might want more equality is that inequality might undermine social order and cause crime or unrest, which are sort of like externalities. So reducing inequality might be actually a way of reducing those externalities. The earned income tax credit is a way to get people into the labor force and actually working who might otherwise not be working. So that's another interesting issue in optimal tax design. Professions might create externalities, and taxes might be a way of getting people to change which profession they do, right? So, for example, if you think finance is a terrible thing, and you think law is a terrible thing, given that many of the people that earn the highest incomes are in those professions, taxing high incomes might actually encourage people to go into research or engineering or something like that that are in lower professions. Yeah, Andre.
I guess ideally you tax the wealth. Everybody's born, you take a chunk away. Everybody has been sent to work as hard as
Yeah.
they can. What about consumption taxes? You don't touch at all.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, consumption taxes are pretty close to being equivalent to income taxes, at least in the framework we're talking about, because the only reason people earn income is in order to consume. The only difference between those is consumption taxes don't tax like bequests, though they do actually, because your children will have to pay the consumption tax. So consumption taxes only differ from income taxes in ways that are pretty subtle. So I don't really want to get into those, was the reason I didn't deal with that. But okay, So all of these, I think, are really interesting open areas of research and for a thesis and so forth. And I think there's lots of other issues that are left out of the analysis we've gone through. So I hope you guys will think about researching this topic. I think it's a really interesting topic. Good luck on the last problem set, and have a great Thanksgiving. See you guys soon.